Hey everybody, it's EJ from eyedesyn.com, and in today's tutorial we're going to put on our plaid shirts, take our axe, and we're going to make some 2D illustrative looking wood patterns inside of Cinema 4D. So this is a great technique to create 2D wood patterns that you can use for compositions or 2D animations inside of After Effects. So let's learn how. Alright, so here is our wood that we're going to be creating today inside of Cinema 4D. So I'm going to walk you through how easy it is to create this really nice 2D wood pattern, and then how to add this nice little finishing grunge as well. So let's go ahead and make some wood. We're going to create a cylinder, and we'll have the orientation in the positive X, so it's laying on its side. So now we can just go ahead and start applying some wood materials. So what I'm going to do is double click in the material manager to create a new material. We'll name this wood. And what I'm going to do to make this completely 2D is I want to remove the diffuse shading here that you can see in this little preview, because this just gives the illusion of this is a 3D object. I want this to be very flat. So I'll turn off the color and reflectance and just turn on the luminance. And then what that's going to do is load up just a flat color that almost fills whatever we apply to it. So you can see that in our viewport. If I go into interactive render region, that gives us an example of what this is going to look like when it's rendered. And I'm just going to drag this triangle quality slider up so we got high quality. You can see that we just have flat texture and gives the illusion that this is now 2D. So what I'm going to do is load the wood shader in our luminance channel. So let's just go ahead and grab a wood shader, and it's underneath the surfaces, and that's actually cut off at the bottom of the screen. It's the very last thing is wood. Trust me, it's there, just at the very bottom of the surface menu. I'm going to load that up, and you're going to see, boom, we got some nice looking wood. Nice looking wood right there. But it looks too realistic, and this is why the wood shader exists, is because most of the time people want to make realistic wood, add really nice realistic textures and all that good stuff. But what we're going to be doing today is using the wood shader to create a more 2D kind of wood pattern. And how to just turn this into like a 2D pattern is very, very easy. So the first thing we're going to do is just remove the interpolation of the blending of this gradient color that's applying the color to our wood. So what I'm going to do is twirl down this little triangle here, and the interpolation is now smooth between the two color chips here. What I'm going to do is just remove the interpolation or the smoothness altogether by choosing none. And then what I can do is move this right color chip over here, this darker color chip, and just move it slightly over. And we can actually move this over as much as we want for whatever kind of thickness we want of our little kind of wood band, grain bands here. And we can actually change the color here as well. So we can make this maybe a little bit more stylized and get that kind of pinkish wood color that we had from the get-go. And then we had some white here as well. So maybe just a little bit of off-white, something like that. And what you're going to notice is that this kind of looks kind of cruddy. And the reason for this is this grainy that is really there for realistic wood grain effects for this wood shader. But again, since we're going to be using this as a 2D shader, we don't actually need any of that realistic grain. So I'm going to just turn the grain down. And the grain scale we don't have to worry about because there is no grain. And voila, we have a very nice looking 2D wood pattern applied to our 3D cylinder here. So we can just cover some of these settings here now. And the first is the overall scale of the wood texture. So we can do this one of two ways. We can either scale this up using the scale option, or we can actually use the texture mode here. By clicking on the texture mode here, we can see this grid pop up. And what this allows us to do is kind of move around our texture here. Now you can see that this actually isn't moving anything. You can see that this little band here is just kind of staying there. So moving this doesn't do anything. But if we hit the T key and bring up our scale, or just go to the scale button here and scale this down, you can see that is not doing anything either. And the one thing we need to do, I'm just going to undo all this stuff. You can notice that as I'm dragging and dragging and clicking and dragging, clicking and dragging, dragging and clicking, that this isn't scaling proportionately. And that's kind of one of the big weird things about scaling. You can see that even if I hold shift, I'm not constrained or proportionally scaling this proportionally on the X, Y, and Z. And I'm just going to quickly undo all this stuff. And the reason for that is, and this is one thing I didn't realize until recently, if we want to scale proportionately in texture mode, we need to turn on enable axis modification mode. And you can see that now we have this nice little cube here, this little bounding box. And now if I hit T and scale this down, you can actually see that not only are we scaling proportionately, but this is actually scaling down and scaling up our wood texture. So now you can definitely see a lot of stuff happening here. Now, one thing we can do as well is maybe we want to rotate this texture, this wood shader too. So what I'm going to do is I can either hit the R key or just go to the rotate tool, and then I'm going to hold down shift so I can constrain the rotational movement to increments of 10. I'll just turn this 90 degrees. And now you can see we have more streaking happening here. And this is going to be better to kind of show how the next option works on our wood shader. And that is the stretch. So what the stretch does is basically we have the kind of the ring where you actually sliced the wood in half. And it's very important that you actually rotate this texture. I don't know why it doesn't show up correctly on a cylinder, but you actually have to rotate it that 90 degrees to get this. But at the top here, you can kind of see the wood texture as it's like kind of sliced, and you could typically see the rings. And the stretch is the texture and how it stretches along like the growth axis of the tree or the branch. So right now this stretch value is up to 20, so you can see this texture is very, very stretched. So if we maybe bring this down to 5, you can see that that texture is a lot less stretched, and we can see a lot more of this nice waviness here. So that's looking really, really good. So I'm just going to bring this down to maybe 3 and see what that looks like. And you can see we're introducing a lot more of that nice little wavy knots and stuff like that. And this looks really, really awesome as like a wood texture. And I'm just going to get out of my texture mode and out of my axis mode so we can actually get rid of the bounding box and all that stuff. So the next thing is the ring scale. Now these are the actual ring patterns and how big they are. So if I bring this up to say 15, you can see that that actually just kind of inflates and scales up the entire texture as well. So if we make this very small, you can see we have a lot more rings, and just kind of work how many rings you want in your little pattern. I like the default of like 5 there, just because we got a really good representation of the pattern, and we get some of these little knots on the edges here. All right, so grainy we already discussed. We don't need it for this effect. Wavy is the kind of like the wavy turbulence that is undulating and kind of distorting this wood pattern. So if I scale this up to say 150, you can see that actually scaling up adds noise and more distortion. So if I crank this up to like 500, you can see that we have a lot more distortion. So this is like the wavy strength here. So I think I'm just going to leave this at 50. We can see what happens when there's very low waviness. We got more of these just kind of straight lines here, which depending on what look you're going for, you can kind of play around with how much waviness you like. And then we have the wavy scale, which is self-explanatory. It's the scale of that wavy turbulence as it's distorting the wave. So if I make this very small, you can see this is like a psychedelic piece of wood or something. I don't know what's going on there. It's a wood on an acid trip. But I'm just going to leave the wavy scale at about 50. Now, the last option here, before we go to annual rings, is shift. And shift is super, super important. So say we have multiple pieces of wood. If I just go ahead and I duplicate this cylinder and move this over, you can see that we have the exact same looking piece of wood. It's got the same exact pattern. Now, if I go ahead and adjust the shift though, it's actually switching up and changing the pattern of our wood. So if I duplicate this wood material, apply this to our second cylinder here, and then in that second new material that we just created, I just adjust the shift. You can see now we have a unique wood pattern, so just by using the shift here. So using the shift is very important if you're trying to iterate and create a bunch of pieces of wood. You can maintain the same settings and then just adjust the shift and you'll have a unique piece of wood sitting there. So shift, very important. The last thing I'm going to cover that is very important is, let me just jump back into my wood shader here, is the annual rings. So let's just move this shift back to 0 there because I liked how that pattern looked at 0. So the last thing is annual rings, and if I turn this on, you can see that at least on the cap of this, or the top of this cylinder, we have this nice ring pattern, this nice wood ring pattern that's on the top there. So this is basically what annual rings does, is it recreates the sliced inside of the growth ring part of the wood pattern. So what we can do is, I'll just leave this material as like the pattern that we're going to leave on the outside here, like along the growth axis. And then what I'm going to do is duplicate this wood, and this will just be like the rings on the cap of our cylinder. So what I'll do, let's get out of interactive render region here, and I'll just make this cylinder editable by hitting the C key. And now I can go ahead, hit U, L for loop selection, select that cap, and probably a good idea to select this back cap as well. And then I can go ahead and drag and drop this ring material onto that selection. You can see that now we have a different material applied to our caps here. And what I can do with this new ring material is go and check on annual rings here. Now, something weird happens with a new material. Remember how we had to go into texture mode, go into the enable axis modification mode, and rotate? So I'm going to hit R and rotate along the green band, or the Y rotation here, and just rotate that 90 degrees. And now you can see that this wood material is actually applied correctly. So it's a really weird thing. I don't know why it doesn't just work with a cylinder, but sometimes you might need to rotate your wood texture just to get it looking the right way. So with that rotation, we now have this really nice annual ring. It's the rings of the wood that is now on the caps of our cylinder and looking really, really nice. So again, we can, while we're still in our texture mode and enable axis modification mode here, I can go ahead and scale this down if I want, or scale this up. And you can see that we can also move this as well to maybe center, and I'm just moving this constrained along the Y and X axis here. And you can see that moving that actually moves where the center of that wood knot is. So kind of important to kind of position this wherever you want and scale it up however large you want as well to get what kind of, annual ring knot look on the caps of your wood. All right, so we have our wood pattern looking really nice. The one thing we can do is, if you want to render this out, I mean, this looks pretty 2D. We can complete the look by just adding a camera, looking through it by clicking this little viewport icon, and then changing this to a camera perspective that's way more flat. So I call it the SimCity camera, where it's isometric, but I'm going to choose parallel. And what you're going to notice is this just flattens out our wood pattern. So no matter how we look at this, this is going to look way more geometric and way more 2D and illustrative. So if you want to just stop here and you're like, this is nice, I don't need anything else, knock yourself out. One thing I do want to mention before we go any further is that maybe you're not even creating 3D geometry in here. Using this wood shader is actually really nice to just, make a plane object here. And let's just have this face our camera by changing the orientation to Z. And we can just apply this wood pattern. I'll just hide the cylinder here by clicking here and just turning the stop lights to red. and just make this interactive render region bigger here. What you can actually do is just apply a wood material to a plane, render this out, and use this as a pattern or a texture for use inside of After Effects. So, you can make patterns with this. And again, you can make a crap ton of patterns, which is the official word of a lot of patterns, is adjusting the shift. And you can, render that, and, adjust this shift and just keep rendering all these different wood patterns here and use them in your 2D artwork as a texture inside of After Effects. So kind of important, like nice little handy tip there of generating a texture in 3D and using it in 2D. A lot of people might not think of that type of workflow. All right, back to our little wood piece here. And again, if you want to just leave this flat, you can do that, or we can add a little bit more of shading or more depth by adding some cell shading. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to double click on my wood texture here. And what I'm actually going to do is create a layer shader. And what a layer shader is going to allow us to do is place our wood shader inside this layer. And basically we have like a Photoshop layer system that we can then add other effects or shaders and mix them using blending mode. So very much like Photoshop, you can have a bunch of layers and use blending mode. So I have my wood shader. I'm going to go ahead and load up my Sketch and Tune cell shader here. And then I can just simply choose multiply mode and just go into the cell shader. And I'm just going to use some grayscale values here. Remove this knot, just move this over. And the cell shader basically applies cell shading to your object. And right now it's using the camera as a light source. I'm going to turn that off and just turn on lights. So it actually use lights in our scene, but you can see we actually don't have any lights yet. That's fine. And we're also going to, when we create that light, want to use its shadows to help shade our object as well. So we can adjust this gradient knot to kind of control how much of this gray texture and white texture shows up. And again, this is being multiplied on top of our wood shader there. So you can just adjust this as you like. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and create a light. And I'm just going to use an infinite light and just add some hard shadows, ray trace shadows here. And how an infinite light works is it's like a massive light source like the sun that shoots parallel light towards your object. And it just adds for a nice, more 2D or flat kind of look compared to like a spotlight or something like that. So I can adjust the angle of this light. That's how you adjust the light, is just by angle. Position doesn't, moving the position of the light doesn't change anything, just the angle. So you can get this looking how you want, get that nice little maybe shaded bit just on the bottom there. And if we want to increase how much of that dark shading, cell shading is there, we can just move this knot a little bit more to the right, and you can see that this is actually growing how much of that color is mapped and showing up on the surface there. So I'm actually not going to add any cell shading to the top cap here, just because I want it to stay this nice bright color. But what I am going to do in my cell shader here is add a little bit more of a stylized look. And I want to add that nice little grain that I showed in that original image off the top. And to do that, I actually have a tutorial that covers this subject as well. So definitely check that out. I'll link to it. Is adding grain via the bump channel. So I can use the bump channel in my material here to kind of add some grain. So in my cell shader, I got the use bump. I'm going to go into my bump channel, check that on, and then what I'm going to do is load up just some simple noise. And you're going to see that once I have that applied, it's kind of distorting and breaking up the shading, the cell shading on my object. And that's all because we have this use bump on. If we don't have that on, we don't have any change at all. So what we can do now is go into the bump, go into our noise, and maybe scale this down to something very small like 5%. And you can see that we now have this small noise in our bump channel that's now distorting and basically creating some really cool grain on our wood shader there. And we can adjust the strength of this, and this is basically going to grow how how far our grain kind of reaches. And, you know, so you can adjust this however much you want. If you want more grain, if you want less grain, maybe you just want a tiny bit of grain on the bottom, you just adjust the strength all the way to a low value. But I think I like somewhere in here, maybe 30%, something like that. And again, if we want to maybe darken the shade here or even introduce some color, we can definitely do that as well by just coloring the diffuse here. And you can see that we have this kind of nice, maybe we just sample one of this pink material, maybe darken it, and we have this nice kind of stylized grain there as well. Just change the color, or we just keep it grayscale again, maybe just make it a little bit darker. So whatever you want to do, if you want to add some blue, go nuts, knock yourself out with whatever kind of grunge you want. Now we want to add some of that grunge to the cap of our cylinder. And the problem with, if we just went over here, just copied our cell shader. So I'm going to go to copy shader. I right click, copy shader, go into my rings, again load up the layer shader here, and go into the layer and just paste shader and choose multiply. And again, we'll need to, load in a noise in the bump, scale this down to 5 as well. You're going to see that we have just noise all over it. And this is because of how this is shaded. This is completely all in the dark area of the shadow of our light, basically. And this is just not going to work. Even if we move the light to have it hit and brighten up this side, it still has grain all over it. So I'm just going to undo our light. So the cell shader is not going to work for the caps here. But one thing we can do is use a gradient. And again, I'm just going to multiply this. And I can go into the gradient and I can change the type from 2DU, which is just, applying a gradient vertically here, and change this to 2D circular. And then I can just right click and just invert the knot so I have the darker part of the gradient on the outside. Now what happens when we choose a 2D circular or any kind of different noise here, sometimes we get this turbulence option, which is really nice. So what we can do is utilize this turbulence and maybe give it a value of like 65. And basically we're introducing some grunge or noise that way. And we'll just bring down the octave detail to about 3. And we're going to scale this way down. So we want very small noise, but actually how the scale works is the higher you go, so say a scale of 2500, the smaller the noise gets. So you can see that this is a nice kind of small noise. Maybe it's a little bit too small. We want to try to match the grain size on our cell shader here. And we can then constrain this maybe and just kind of adjust the gradient knots here to maybe add a little bit more contrast there. And you can see that now we're kind of getting a really nice gradient going on. Maybe bring the turbulence down a little bit. So we can kind of adjust this however we want. Adjust how much of that grunge we want and how much that reaches by just adjusting this gradient here. And basically there you go. We have a nice little grungy bit on the front of our wood. And again, we can go ahead and we can even change the color of this. Again, we can make it, maybe a dark blue or something like that to match the color it was on our cell shader noise there as well. So we kind of matched that on the front and looking pretty good. So one last thing I want to show is to add even more grunge is I'm just going to duplicate this wood object, and this will just be like a branch. And I'm just going to scale this down, rotate this up, and we just have this nice little branch sticking up right about there. Something like that. And again, if we really wanted to get technical, we can go and again duplicate the wood texture, adjust that shift so we have a different pattern. But for now, I'm going to be super lazy and just rotate that. And there we go. And what I'm going to do is add a little bit more noise, and I'm going to add more noise via ambient occlusion. So ambient occlusion is in the effects here, and basically what ambient occlusion does, you can see a little bit of dark shading happen, and basically is recreating what happens in real life when two objects are close together. They kind of self-shade. And what I'm going to do is kind of make this a little bit more contrasty. And to add more grain, I'm actually just going to bring the accuracy and the samples down to about 1. And you can see this is just some really nice grain. Now I can increase the contrast there as well to maybe make it to 50. I can also adjust the dispersion, which is also the spread of that shading, to maybe make it a little bit more centralized. I can also change this to a lighter gray to try to help this fit in with everything else we have here. Or I can even introduce a color like blue, and we can have nice little hints of blue in here as well. If we added like a disc for the floor, you can see that now we have a lot of that blue on the bottom there, which I think is a really cool kind of look there too. And let's just add like just a flat material here. So we'll just use the luminance and maybe just get a dark blue color, load that up in there, something like that. So you can see that we have nice, even some ambient occlusion happening on the floor here as well. We can go ahead and add in a background, so we can add some of this background color here too. And there we go. The one last thing I want to cover, that's looking pretty nice, right? We got some nice 2D wood, but it's created in 3D, so really, really cool stuff. I would say that the grunge is a little bit heavy-handed, but you know what? Whatever, we're just going to roll with it. The last thing we can do, or the last thing I want to cover, is rendering this out. So we're dealing with 2D here. One thing I always like to tell people to do is go into your anti-aliasing and of course choose best anti-aliasing so we have nice crisp edges. But the filter, typically people render out with the animation filter, and this actually blurs, and I don't know if this actually picks up, but actually blurs a little bit because it tries to prevent flickering when things are animated very fast. And you know, typically that's how you want it with animation, but for 2D objects, we probably want something sharper. So we can use cubic, which kind of sharpens everything up, sharpens up all the textures, or sync is also one I use as well. And it just keeps that nice crispy edges, crispy textures, those nice sharp edges that fit well with, you know, rasterized shape layers and stuff that you may be using this with inside of After Effects. So just one last little helpful render tip there for you guys as well. But basically that's a very easy way to create some nice wood patterns using the wood shader inside of Cinema 4D. Alright, so we used the Cinema 4D wood shader to create a 2D wood pattern that we can then use to create nice 2D wood looks inside of Cinema 4D, or just render the pattern out and use that as a texture in Photoshop or After Effects. So if you have any questions about the wood shader or anything I covered in this tutorial, please leave those questions in the comments section below. Just want to remind you that I also have a bunch of tutorials on the cell shader as a whole, so check out the cell shader playlist in my YouTube channel. Also, check out the stylized grainy cell shader look tutorial if you want to learn more about creating nice 2D grain on your cell shader. Definitely check those out. And if you create anything using this tutorial, I'd love to see all of your fun 2D pieces of wood inside of Cinema 4D. So definitely share them with me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitters, all that good stuff. And if you like this tutorial, please hit the like button. If you like my tutorials, please subscribe. I'd really appreciate that. And as always, really appreciate all of you out there watching these tutorials. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye, everybody.